My stepmother stood up at my father's memorial luncheon in front of 90 people and announced that the house I'd lived in my whole life was now hers and that I had 30 days to get out. Then she smiled at me like she'd just done me a favor. What she didn't know was that the silver-haired woman 2 tables over had stopped eating, set down her fork, and was already reaching for her phone. Before I tell you how that woman tore my stepmother's entire scheme apart in about 4 minutes flat, I have to back up, because none of it makes sense without the rest. And hey, wherever you're watching from tonight, drop your city in the comments. I always like knowing who's out there with me. Make sure you stick around to the end, because the part that still gives me chills happened in a parking lot 3 weeks later. My name doesn't matter as much as the fact that I'm 29. I teach 4th grade in a town outside Columbus, Ohio. And until that luncheon, I genuinely believed grief was the worst thing a person could feel in a single afternoon. I was wrong about that. There's something worse, and it's watching someone use your father's death as a business opportunity while his ashes are still in an urn 10 feet away. Let me tell you about my dad. His name was Walter, and he built furniture. Not as a hobby, as a living. He had a workshop behind our house that smelled like cedar and machine oil, and from the time I could walk, I was out there with him, handing him clamps, sweeping sawdust, learning the difference between a dovetail and a finger joint before I learned long division. My mom died when I was 7, a car accident on an icy on-ramp. And after that, it was just me and Dad in that workshop. He raised me on patience and second chances, and the belief that you measure twice because people deserve your care the first time. The house was nothing fancy. A 4-bedroom on 2 acres at the edge of town, paid off the year I started high school. But Dad poured himself into it. He built the kitchen cabinets. He laid the oak floors in the living room by hand, board by board, on his knees. The winter I turned 11, there was a spot near the back door where he'd carved my height every birthday, little pencil and knife marks climbing up the door frame. That house wasn't an asset. It was him. It was every Saturday morning, every burnt pancake, every time he sat on the edge of my bed and told me I was going to be okay even when I didn't believe it. He met my stepmother when I was 23. Her name was Bernadine. And I want to be fair, because for a while I really tried. She came into his life after a decade of him being alone, and at first I was glad. She laughed at his jokes. She seemed interested in the furniture. She'd show up with casseroles and compliments, and this way of touching his arm when she talked that made him stand up a little straighter. He'd been lonely longer than he ever admitted, and here was somebody who looked at him like he hung the moon. They got married when I was 24. Small ceremony, just family. In the backyard under the maple Dad planted the year I was born. I gave a toast. I meant it. I told her I was happy my dad had found someone, and I was. It took about a year for the cracks to show. Little things at first. Bernadine didn't like the workshop. Said it was an eyesore. That the noise gave her headaches. That a man Dad's age had no business running power tools. She started talking about selling the place, moving somewhere with less upkeep. Somewhere more befitting. She used words like that. Befitting. She had this idea of herself that the house never quite lived up to. Dad would just nod and let her talk and then go back out to the workshop anyway. He wasn't a fighter. He was a man who avoided conflict the way some people avoid the dentist, by pretending the problem would resolve itself if he didn't look at it directly. And mostly, with Bernadine, that worked. She'd push, he'd go quiet, she'd back off, and a kind of uneasy peace would settle back over the house. What I didn't know, what none of us knew, was how much pushing was happening when I wasn't around. I'd moved out by then. I had my own apartment, my own classroom, my own life, 40 minutes away. I came by on Sundays for dinner, and on those Sundays, everything looked fine. Dad seemed tired, but he was in his 60s and working with his hands, so tired made sense. He'd lost weight, but Bernadine said he just wasn't eating much, that she was trying to get him to see a doctor, that he was stubborn. I believed her. Why wouldn't I? She was his wife. He had a heart attack on a Tuesday in March. He was in the workshop, halfway through a rocking chair for a customer in Cincinnati, and he just sat down on the bench and didn't get up. A neighbor found him when she came to borrow a ladder. By the time the ambulance got there, it was already over. I got the call during third period. I remember the principal coming to my door, and I remember the look on her face, and I remember thinking, with this strange detached clarity, that I was about to become a different person than the one I'd been 10 seconds ago. And I was right. The week after he died is a blur I've mostly chosen not to keep, but I remember enough. I remember Bernadine being oddly composed. I remember her handling the funeral home, the obituary, the arrangements, all of it, with an efficiency that I told myself was her way of coping. Some people fall apart, some people get organized. I was grateful, honestly. I could barely string a sentence together, and she was making decisions. The memorial luncheon was her idea. She wanted it at the country club out by the highway, the one Dad never once set foot in while he was alive, because he thought it was full of people who'd never built anything with their hands. I thought it was a strange choice, but I didn't have the energy to argue. 90-some people came. Dad's customers, the neighbors, the guys from the lumberyard, my cousins, a few of my teacher friends who came to hold me up. And one woman I didn't recognize, sitting at a table near the windows. Silver hair, sharp eyes, a navy blazer. I figured she was a friend of Bernadine's. The food was served. People said kind things. My cousin got up and told a story about Dad teaching him to fish and not catching anything for 6 hours, and Dad saying that wasn't the point. People laughed and cried at the same time, which is the only honest way to grieve somebody good. And then Bernadine stood up and tapped her water glass with a spoon. I thought she was going to say a few words about Dad. I braced myself for it because I wasn't sure I could survive a widow's speech without coming apart in front of everyone. I reached for my cousin's hand under the table. "I want to thank you all for coming," she started, and her voice was steady, almost bright. "Walter touched so many lives. He was a wonderful man." A pause. People nodded. "And I know he'd want me to be practical, even now. So I'm going to take a moment, while we're all together, to share some news about how things are going to move forward." I felt my stomach drop before my brain even caught up. There was something rehearsed about it. Something staged. As many of you know, Walter and I built a beautiful life in that house. We did not, I thought. You complained about that house for 5 years, and it's been a comfort to me through this terrible time. So I've decided to stay there, to keep his memory alive. She turned and she looked right at me. "Which means, sweetheart, that you'll need to make other arrangements. I'm giving you 30 days to clear out your old room. I think that's more than fair." The room went quiet in a way that I can only describe as physical, like the air pressure changed. I want you to understand something. I wasn't living in that house. I had my own apartment. But my whole childhood was in that house. My mother's piano was in that house. Dad's workshop and every tool he ever owned, and the door frame with my height carved into it, was in that house. And here she was, in front of 90 people, dressed in black, telling me I had 30 days to come collect my childhood like it was a storage unit she needed to clear. But that wasn't even the part that made my ears start ringing. It was the word she used. Stay. I've decided to stay. As if it were hers to decide. As if the house were already hers. "Bernadine," I said, and my voice came out smaller than I wanted. "Dad's house is mine now, dear." She said it gently. That was the worst part. She said it so gently, with so much fake tenderness, like she was breaking hard news to a child. Spouses inherit. It's just how it works. I didn't want to get into the legal details today, but since you brought it up. She smiled around the room, inviting them to see how patient she was being with me. "I know it's a lot. Grief makes us emotional. But the sooner we accept reality, the easier it is on everyone." And a few people, God help them, nodded. Because it sounded reasonable. Because she'd said it with such confidence. Because in the absence of any other information, the woman in the widow's dress sounded like she knew what she was talking about. And the red-faced young woman about to cry looked like she was just having a hard time letting go. I stood up. I don't even remember deciding to. My chair scraped against the floor and the sound was enormous. "You complained about that house for years," I said. "You called the workshop an eyesore. You wanted to sell it. Dad told me." My voice cracked. "Dad told me you wanted to sell it and he said no. He said he was never selling that house." "Oh, honey," she tilted her head. "You're confused. Grief does that." And then quieter, just to me but loud enough that the nearby tables could hear. "Don't make a scene at your father's memorial. He'd be embarrassed." That landed like a slap. Worse than a slap. A slap heals. That sentence was designed to make me doubt my own memory of my own father in the one room where I most needed him. I sat down. I'm not proud of it. I sat down because I didn't have a single fact to fight her with. She had confidence, and she had the law on her side. Or at least she sounded like she did, and I had grief and a 30-year-old memory of a man who couldn't back me up anymore. And that's when the silver-haired woman at the window table set down her fork. She didn't stand right away. She just looked at Bernadine for a long, quiet moment. The way you look at a math problem you've already solved and you're just double-checking the work. Then she picked up her cloth napkin, dabbed the corner of her mouth, set it down, and rose to her feet. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said, and her voice carried without any effort at all. The kind of voice that's used to a courtroom. "My name is Margaret Andrews. I was Walter's attorney for the last 11 years. He came to my office 4 months ago, and I think there are a few things that need to be cleared up before anyone starts packing boxes. I have never in my life seen a face change as fast as Bernadine's did." "This is a private family matter," Bernadine said, and the brightness was gone, replaced by something thin and quick. "I don't think." "It became a public matter," Margaret said pleasantly, "when you announced your interpretation of the estate to 90 witnesses. I'm just here to make sure the record's accurate." She turned to address the room, calm as anything. "I want to be respectful of the day. Walter was a dear man and a careful one. He did not, as it happens, leave his estate intestate. He had a will. He updated it this past November. I drafted it myself. You could have heard a pin drop. I was holding my breath." Bernadine had gone the color of paper. "In Ohio," Margaret continued, "if a man dies without a will and leaves a spouse and one child from a prior marriage, the estate does split, and a surviving spouse can inherit a significant share. I suspect that's the arithmetic some people were counting on." She let that sit, but Walter did have a will. And in it, the house, the land, the contents of the workshop, and his tools were left, in their entirety, to his daughter. Not to his wife. The sound that came out of me was not dignified. It was half a sob and half a gasp, and I clapped my hand over my mouth. "That's not possible," Bernadine said. "We were married. I'm his wife. A wife can't just be cut out. There are laws." "You thinking of the elective share?" Margaret said, and now there was the faintest edge under the politeness, like a blade under a velvet cloth. "And you're right that a surviving spouse in Ohio generally can't be entirely disinherited. You'd be entitled to elect against the will for a portion of the estate. Ordinarily." She paused. "Except Walter, on my advice, asked you to sign something before the two of you married. Do you remember signing a prenuptial agreement, Bernadine? In my office? With your own attorney present?" Bernadine's mouth opened and closed. "I have a copy," Margaret said. "I have the original, actually, in my files. In it, you waived your right to elect against any future will of his and waived any claim to the house, which he owned free and clear long before he ever met you. You kept your own assets. He kept his. You signed it willingly, with counsel, 11 days before the wedding." She smiled, and it was not unkind, which somehow made it worse for Bernadine. "I remember because you were wearing a yellow dress and you told me you thought prenups were tacky, but you'd sign anything for Walter. Those were your words. I will remember the silence in that room until the day I die." 90 people who had, 30 seconds earlier, been quietly siding with the gracious widow, all recalibrating at once. I watched it happen on their faces. I watched the sympathy slide off Bernadine like water off a windshield. "This is harassment," Bernadine tried. "At a funeral. You should be ashamed." "What's the harassment?" asked a man near the back. "Is telling that girl she's got 30 days to leave her own house." It was Roy, from the lumber yard, a man who'd known my dad for 20 years and who I had never once heard raise his voice. "We all just heard you do it, Bernadine." I didn't say anything. I couldn't. Margaret crossed the room, and she leaned down next to me, and she put a card in my hand, and she said, very quietly, "Just for me, your father loved you very much. He told me you were the best thing he ever made. He wanted me to be here today, in case." And then a little louder, "Call me Monday. We'll go over everything. There's nothing to worry about. The house is yours, free and clear. It always was. Here is the part I didn't understand until later. The part that still makes my chest tight. Dad had known. Not that he was going to die in March, but that something wasn't right. He'd been losing weight. He'd been tired. And 4 months before his heart gave out, he'd quietly driven to a lawyer's office and made absolutely certain that no matter what happened, no matter who pressured him or pretended or schemed, the house would land in my hands and nobody else's. He never told me. He just took care of it, the way he took care of everything, measuring twice, so I'd only have to be cut once. Bernadine left the luncheon. She didn't say goodbye to anyone. She gathered her purse and walked out with her chin up like she was making a choice instead of fleeing, and the country club doors swung shut behind her, and I sat there with Margaret Untersich's card in my hand and my father's friends gathering around me. And for the first time in a week, I felt like I could breathe. I wish I could tell you that was the end of it, but people like Bernadine don't lose gracefully. They regroup. The first thing she did, I found out from Margaret, was hire her own lawyer to contest the will. She claimed Dad hadn't been of sound mind when he signed it. She claimed I had manipulated him, an elderly grieving widower, into changing his estate plan. That one almost made me laugh because Dad changed the will before he died, when he was still very much married to her and I hadn't known anything about it. But she threw it at the wall anyway, hoping something would stick. It didn't. Margaret had been thorough in the way that only a person who has watched 100 families implode over money can be thorough. She had Dad's medical records, from the month he signed, showing he was lucid. She had a video the office recorded of the signing, standard practice in her firm for exactly this reason, in which Dad explains in his own slow, careful voice why he's doing what he's doing. I watched that video. I had to do it in Margaret's office with a box of tissues, because Dad looks right into the camera at one point and says, "I want my girl to have the house. She's the only one who ever loved it for the right reasons." He didn't name Bernadine. He didn't have to. The contest fell apart in a matter of weeks. But the part that happened in the parking lot was different. That had nothing to do with lawyers. About 3 weeks after the luncheon, I went back to the house for the first time. I'd been avoiding it. Margaret had the locks changed for me, gave me the new keys, told me to take my time. I parked in the driveway where I'd parked 10,000 times growing up, and I sat there for a minute just looking at it. The workshop, the maple tree, the kitchen window, and then Bernadine's car pulled in behind me, blocking me in. She got out fast. She'd clearly been waiting, parked down the street, watching for me. And the gracious widow was gone completely. Her face was twisted with a fury I'd never seen on her. Not in 5 years of Sunday dinners. "You think you won," she said, walking up to my window. I rolled it down maybe 2 inches, my heart hammering. "You little thief. You turned him against me. That house should be mine. I took care of him. I cooked for him. I gave him the best years. You wanted to sell it," I said. My voice was shaking, but I said it. "You called his life's work an eyesore. You couldn't wait for him to be gone." Something flickered across her face then, and I swear to you, for 1 second, the mask dropped all the way. "He was supposed to sell it," she hissed. "He promised me. After we got married, he was supposed to sell this dump, and we were going to move to Scottsdale." He kept stalling. Stalling and stalling, for that workshop and for you. She spat the word. "And then he had the gall to die before he fixed it." Before he fixed it, as if my father's death were an inconvenience in her financial planning. What she didn't know, what she had no way of knowing, was that I wasn't alone. Margaret had told me never to come to the house by myself in those first weeks, and I hadn't listened, but Roy from the lumberyard had taken it upon himself to keep an eye on the place. He'd been pulling weeds out front when I arrived, around the side where I hadn't seen him, and he'd heard every word. And so had his phone, which he'd started recording the second Bernadine's car came tearing into the driveway, because Roy was a careful man too, the way my father had been careful. "You can stop right there," Roy said, stepping into view. Bernadine spun around. The color drained out of her again, that same paper white from the luncheon. "I got all of it," Roy said, holding up the phone. "The part about how he was supposed to sell it. The part about Scottsdale. The part where you just admitted in your own words that you married a man planning to liquidate everything he loved out from under him." He looked at her with a contempt so quiet it was almost gentle. "Margaret's going to want to hear this. Might be relevant to that little will contest of yours. Funny how he wasn't of sound mind, sits next to he promised me he'd sell. She dropped the will contest 4 days later. I'd like to say I felt triumphant. Mostly I just felt tired and sad and relieved in a way that had nothing to do with winning. Because here's the thing about getting justice: when the person who should be there to see it is gone, it doesn't fill the hole. It just stops someone from making the hole bigger. The legal side wrapped up cleaner than I had any right to expect. The will held. The prenup held. The recording from the parking lot never even needed to be used in court because Bernadine folded before it got that far. But it sits in a file in Margaret's office to this day, and I sleep better knowing it's there. Bernadine moved out of state. Not to Scottsdale, last I heard. Somewhere cheaper. She'd spent a good chunk of her own money on lawyers chasing a house she was never entitled to. And she came away with exactly what she'd brought into the marriage, which was the deal she signed 11 days before the wedding, in a yellow dress, telling everyone she thought prenups were tacky. I never pressed any charges. People ask me why. The honest answer is that my father wouldn't have wanted his memory tangled up in a courtroom drama, and I was done letting Bernadine cost me things, including my peace. Walking away wasn't weakness. It was the one move she couldn't counter. I live in the house now. I moved in that summer. I teach at a school 10 minutes away instead of 40. The workshop is exactly how Dad left it. The rocking chair for the customer in Cincinnati still half finished on the bench, and I haven't been able to bring myself to touch it. But I go out there sometimes just to sit and smell the cedar and the machine oil and feel close to him. I found something a few months after I moved in. Tucked in the back of his tool chest, wrapped in a shop rag, there was an envelope with my name on it in his blocky carpenter's handwriting. Inside was a short note. It said he was sorry he'd married someone who didn't understand what the house meant, that he'd been a coward about it for too long, and that he'd finally done the one brave thing he could do, which was make sure I'd never have to fight for what was already mine. At the bottom he'd written, "Measure twice. Love, Dad." I had Margaret's card framed. It hangs in the entryway, next to the door frame with my height carved into it, the marks climbing up from when I was a little girl to the last one he made on my 18th birthday. People who come over think it's a strange thing to frame, a lawyer's business card. I tell them it's a long story. If you've got someone in your life who only shows up when there's something to gain, believe them the first time they show you who they are. And if you love something, the way my dad loved that house and loved me, don't be a coward about protecting it. Say it out loud. Write it down. Sign it. Make it impossible to argue with after you're gone. Because the people who love you for the right reasons deserve to be defended, and sometimes the bravest, kindest thing you can do is put it in writing while you still can. My dad measured twice his whole life. In the end, that's what saved me. The thing I keep coming back to is how quietly my dad moved through the world, and how that quietness almost cost me everything, and then turned out to be the very thing that saved me. He wasn't loud. He didn't confront Bernadine when she called his workshop an eyesore. He just kept building. For years I mistook that for weakness, and I think on some level he did too. But what I understand now is that there's a difference between avoiding a fight and choosing your ground. He couldn't change her heart, so he stopped trying. Instead, he drove to Margaret Andrusek's office and put the truth somewhere it couldn't be argued with after he was gone. That wasn't avoidance. That was the most deliberate, loving thing a person can do. Cause and effect ran through that whole memorial like a current. Bernadine stood up so sure of herself because she'd done the math on a man dying without a plan, and she'd never once imagined Walter was quietly outthinking her months ahead. Every cruel thing she said that day was a brick she laid in her own wall. When she told 90 people I had 30 days to get out, she handed them the exact moment they'd remember when the truth landed. People reap what they plant, not because some force is keeping score, but because lies have a shape, and eventually the shape stops fitting reality. What I learned, sitting in that room with my hand over my mouth, is that doing right by people is its own kind of strength. My dad never raised his voice, but he was honest to the bone, and that honesty is what gave Margaret something solid to stand on. I learned that being smart isn't about clever comebacks in the moment. I didn't have a single one. Being smart is preparation. The way Margaret recorded that signing. The way Roy started filming the second a car came tearing up the driveway. And I learned that grit doesn't always look like fighting back. Sometimes it looks like staying in your seat when you have nothing to say. Holding on. Refusing to disappear. until the truth catches up to you. If you take anything from what happened to me, let it be this. Be the kind of person who tells the truth even when no one's clapping, because integrity outlives you. Get wise about protecting what matters before you need to, not after. And when someone tries to make you doubt your own memory of the people you loved, don't let them. Hold the line. I still go out to that workshop and sit where my dad sat, and the half-finished rocking chair is still there. And I think about how he measured twice his whole life so that I'd only ever have to be cut once. He taught me that the brave thing and the kind thing are usually the same thing. You just have to be willing to do it quietly and do it in time.